On February 19, 2001, at the Battlebridge Basin, a part of the Regent's Canal in London, 10 body parts belonging to an unidentified woman were discovered. The body parts were found in 6 different bags and weighed down with bricks. Who was she, and who killed her? These hastily dismembered remains belonged to an ex-girlfriend of John Sweeney, a jealous, perpetually drunken, and vengeful sadist. He referred to himself as a scalp hunter, but the press dubbed him the Canal Killer. Born John Patrick Sweeney on Saturday, October 13, 1956, the boy grew up in Kirkdale, a working-class district of Liverpool. Sweeney's childhood was unremarkable, and devoid of significant events. Although his family was poor, his parents instilled in him a sense of pride, moral values, and the importance of hard work. The boy dreamed of studying art, but he was convinced to choose a more reliable profession. Thus, after training as a carpenter, for 5 years John traveled to different countries, working on construction sites with a bag full of tools, pockets full of cash, and eyes fixed on women. It was during this little-known episode of his life that something changed in John. When he returned to Britain several years later, he came back as an envious, jealous, and malicious person whose life was consumed by a passion for alcohol, illicit substances, and violence. Upon returning to Liverpool, John still looked like the boy who had left a few years earlier, with his tousled red hair and mischievous sparks in his eyes. But his almost childlike face, which always seemed kind and smiling, concealed a growing rage within him. After meeting the lovely Anne Bramley in 1976, John married her and moved in with her. Soon after, they had children. However, it was not a happy union. John was either absent from home and uninvolved in raising the children, or he behaved aggressively and horrifically abused his wife. He often used different aliases, such as Joe Johnson, Joe Carroll, or Liverpool Joe, to hide the increasing number of charges against him for various offences. In 1979, after 3 years of marriage, concerned for the safety of her children and repeatedly reporting her husband to the police, Anne made a courageous decision and filed for divorce. 2 years later, she gave John one last chance, believing that he had changed, overcome his addiction, and that a bright future awaited them. But her husband had not changed. He was still intoxicated, drugged, and dangerous. And he was consumed by a desire for revenge. He was not going to allow her to leave him again. Their second marriage lasted barely a year. Anne escaped to her family in the middle of the night. But no matter how far she ran or how carefully she hid, John always found her. In November 1982, settling with her children in a cottage in a small town, Anne thought she had found refuge, but her peace was shattered because John Sweeney followed her. In the evening, when a piercing wind blew from the hills, covering the moon with dense clouds, and the snow crunched under his feet, John approached the new home of the family. Through a gap in the curtains, he noticed a light in the house but heard no sound and saw no movement. Realizing that nobody was home, the man broke the lock on the back door. Inside, seeing food on the table, children's toys on the floor, and family photos on the fireplace mantel, he felt even more acutely rejected by Anne. John slipped into the darkness of his wife's bedroom, opened the closet, and hid inside. And while he stood there, surrounded by familiar things, inhaling the scent of her perfume, surrounded by everything that reminded him of her departure, John waited for his wife's return with a hammer in one hand and an axe in the other. He didn't have to wait long. Just 2 minutes later, he heard the jingling of her keys. The front door opened, and light sequentially filled each room until he heard quiet footsteps in the bedroom. From the tension, the man's finger joints turned pale as he anxiously gripped the hammer and axe, prepared for a furious attack on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Waiting for the perfect moment, John burst out of the closet and saw 2 police officers in front of him, big, strong guys who already had handcuffs ready. John dropped the weapons, and thoughts raced through his mind about how to explain who he was and what he was doing in the closet with a hammer and axe. He claimed he was preparing a surprise for his wife. One can only guess what kind of surprise it would have been if the police officers hadn't shown up. However, luckily for Anne and the children, they were having a pleasant evening at the neighbor's house when they heard the sound as if someone had entered their home. Assuming it was a burglar, they called the police. John was arrested, but he was not charged with attempted murder or anything similar. Since it is difficult to prove intentions to commit a crime, and considering that everything happened in what could formally be considered his own home, the law couldn't do anything to him. He was released on the condition of staying away from Anne. John started over and moved to London. He returned to Liverpool only to visit his mother. Although he and Anne crossed paths more than once, they managed to maintain civilized relations for the sake of the children until her death in 2001. In the same year, 10 body parts, placed in 6 separate bags and weighted down with bricks, were dumped at the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London. But the body in the canal did not belong to Anne. John never again attempted to take her life. Perhaps he never had the opportunity again, perhaps he still loved her, or perhaps he knew it was wrong to deprive the children of a caring mother. Thus, with the same fury in his eyes, jealousy in his heart, and impatient tremor in his hands, John set off once again in search of love, an unsuspecting girl whom he would attempt to control. And her name was Melissa Halstead. But this time, he turned to his other passion, art, and his dark paintings would unveil the veil of mystery over his much more sinister plans. Born in Ohio, Melissa Halstead was a bright, courageous, and cheerful girl, whose free-spirited nature was balanced by kindness and inner warmth. Melissa always saw the best in people, and although it took her a long time to trust a stranger enough to become her friend, once you became her friend, you became her friend forever. At the age of 15, scouts from the renowned Ford modeling agency in New York took notice of the beautiful and striking girl, and that's where her career began. She traveled across America, Europe, and Asia. By 1986, after a successful modeling career and obtaining education as a makeup artist and photographer, Melissa settled in London in anticipation of a new chapter in her life. Melissa hardly told her family anything about her new boyfriend, whom everyone called Liverpool Joe. Whatever she saw in this red-haired, moody figure was a mystery to everyone, but whatever it wasn't worth it. Because the man didn't hesitate to disfigure her beautiful face, using his fists in fits of drunken rage. These were alarming signs, and Melissa repeatedly tried to leave. Over the course of 12 months of living together, Melissa and John Sweeney, the police were called to her rescue twice when he brutally beat her. But both times, John only received a slap on the wrist, forcing him to pay a fine of £5. In April 1988, the man frightened poor Melissa so much, waving a knife, that in a gruesome foreshadowing of her fate, she told her sister that if she ever disappeared, it meant John had killed her. This time, the court banned him from ever approaching the girl. Melissa's work visa was about to expire, and she continued to travel thousands of kilometers away from John, visiting Austria, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But no matter how far she went, how skillfully she hid, or how cautiously she noticed traces, he always found her. His paranoia fueled by alcohol, his jealousy fueled by rejection, and the court conditions that had no significance beyond Britain allowed him to track down his supposedly unfaithful girlfriend to her new apartment in Vienna, Austria. Without realizing that the shattered relationship was his fault, and driven mad by the thought that Melissa was cheating on him, John burst into the house through the back door, bound and gagged her neighbor, and searched the apartment. He examined every cabinet in search of signs of her infidelity. Melissa had learned from the experiences of his furious attacks. She knew there was no point in arguing, trying to convince him otherwise, or even dignifying him with a response. Instead, understanding that he needed time to cool down, she bought him a ticket to Amsterdam. Whether it was a clever ploy to distract a dangerous lover, a kind gesture to give him a chance to calm down, or an honest promise to resume their relationship is unknown. But it worked. John took the ticket and left. But a few days did not calm him down. On the contrary, He blamed Melissa for everything he had ever experienced because of women who deceived and rejected him. She rejected him like Anne, abandoned him like Anne, and destroyed him like Anne. John's anger came full circle, and it was time to finish what he had started, to seek revenge. On Friday, November 4, 1988, 4 days later and almost 6 years after the failed attack on Anne, John approached Melissa's apartment. Unlike that night, Melissa was at home. Unlike that night, he didn't break in but knocked on the door. Unlike that night, when Melissa saw her stalker had returned, an argument ensued. But just like that night 6 years ago in Anne's cottage, John was prepared. The knuckles of his right hand turned white with impatience as he clenched a hammer. He told Melissa that he had calmed down and simply forgot something in her apartment. Waiting for the moment when Melissa turned her back to him, John gritted his teeth, his hand shot up, and he brought down the steel edge of the hammer on the girl's head. Melissa felt a powerful blow, and her vision instantly darkened, but miraculously she survived. Lying in a hospital bed with bruises and a brain fracture, she declared that all she wanted was to help him, but now she understood that he truly hated her. John was arrested on the same day. Hatred for the girl continued to boil in him while in prison. In his troubles, he blamed only her. And here he resorted to his favorite pastime again, drawing. His drawings were not only frightening, realistic, and highly detailed, but they also served as a confession of the thoughts and desires that consumed him. His imagination was so deranged that it's hard to describe it in words. The most disturbing sketch he sarcastically titled Romantic Weekend 2 in Austria. But if it could be characterized in any way, it was certainly not romantic. However, Melissa knew nothing about the drawings. She believed his tears and assurances that she was all he had, so she took an unexpected step. The judge sentenced John to 12 months in prison and a 10-year ban on entering Austria to protect his victim from any danger. But he was released earlier after an emotional plea from the person he almost killed, Melissa. And on Monday, March 27, 1989, after serving only half of his sentence, 34-year-old John Sweeney walked free, inhaling the fresh Austrian air as the cold breeze played with his red beard. The stunningly beautiful blonde, a former model, kissed him on the lips. Melissa arrived in a car full of luggage to pick up John. They headed to the Netherlands, where they wouldn't be bothered by the deportation order, to start a new life together. However, those 6 months in prison did nothing to rid the man of his drinking habit, his use of illicit substances, his paranoia, jealousy, and his obsession with violence and torture. And their new home was as libertine and indulgent as it was an unsuitable place for someone like him. Although John occasionally worked, his earnings were only enough for alcohol, and it was Melissa's successful career that allowed them to pay for housing, food, and other expenses. Month after month, the beatings were repeated, which the girl concealed behind expertly applied makeup and poorly thought-out excuses. Thanks to her work as a photographer and makeup artist, she traveled a lot, but the more she was absent, the more John drank and filled himself with jealousy and rage. Finally, in late April 1990, Melissa returned home to Amsterdam, to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend. She decided to break up with him for good. On Thursday, May 3, 1990, in a coastal town called Rotterdam, located 50 miles from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a military-style bag appeared on the surface of a canal. Upon seeing it, 2 police officers decided it was either stolen luggage or discarded trash. Inside, they found the torso of a naked woman. Just the torso, without hands, feet, or a head, and there were no belongings or documents present. The perpetrator had removed them and snapped the unfortunate victim's spine in half to fit her into the bag. She had spent just over a week in the water before being discovered. However, that was all the police could determine for certain because the killer had made maximum efforts to destroy all clues to her identity. The skull injury from a recent attack by her boyfriend could have provided a clue to her identity besides dental records, but all the police had was an unnamed torso, lacking any name, teeth, surgical scars, birthmarks, tattoos, or fingerprints. Since no missing persons matching her description had been reported in Rotterdam, Melissa was marked as Jane Doe and buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. We will never know exactly how or where she died. We do not know how her killer transported her body from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. Perhaps he took a train, wondering what other passengers would think if they knew what was in his bag. But we do know that in Rotterdam, he chose a canal that ran through the heart of the city, waited for the opportune moment, and simply tossed the bag into the water. As Melissa worked a lot and traveled on assignments, her family in Ohio did not immediately realize they hadn't heard from her in a while. The last time she left a message on the answering machine, congratulating her mother on her birthday, and then she stopped calling. So in November 1990, the family hired a lawyer to investigate her disappearance. But they realized it too late. Her apartment was completely empty and meticulously cleaned, with no trace of the former tenants. Melissa had vanished, and John returned to Britain, embarking on his search for love, girls, once again. And her name was Delia Baymer. Having met John at a pub in early 1991, Delia was struck by the charisma of a man who lived a seemingly heavenly life. Being overly trusting by nature, she quickly allowed John to move into her apartment, just 1.5 miles from the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London's Paddington. But together they appeared to be a strange pair. She was a fragile blonde, a nurse who saved lives, and he was a red-haired psychopath with one past murder, one attempted murder, and at least one future murder. Delia brought warmth and coziness into the home, while John complemented it with illicit substances, alcohol, a tarantula, stacks of horror magazines, and a collection of gruesome paintings depicting scenes of violence, severed body parts, blood, torture, and headless female bodies. As before, he quickly revealed his true nature, striving to exert full control over Delia's life and exploding with rage if things didn't go the way he wanted. 2 years later, Delia gathered the courage to ask him to leave. He agreed, but he kept delaying the moment, continuing to exert control over every aspect of her life. In 1994, Delia managed to escape his watchful gaze and spent a day with a friend. When she returned, John flew into a rage. As punishment, he tied the helpless woman to her bed, using the same rope he had once used to bind Melissa's lifeless body. For unbearable 48 hours, he tortured Delia, repeatedly violating her, beating her, strangling her, and threatening her. John held a gun to her head and threatened to cut out her tongue with a kitchen knife if she screamed. In his frenzy, he began to tell her the story of his previous girlfriend, who had tried to leave him and supposedly met her end in the canals of Rotterdam. Allegedly, he caught her with 2 Germans. He killed all 3. Not knowing what to do with them, he sat with the bodies for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he dismembered them, packed them into bags, and threw them into the canal. Delia had studied John well and didn't even attempt to argue, curse, resist, or scream. She didn't even allow herself to think about it, as if he could read her thoughts. Perhaps that's why, like Anne, he didn't kill her. And no one knows why. The man fled to Germany, but since the police knew his appearance and the fake names he used, he was arrested and deported back to Britain. Her tormentor sat in prison, but Delia was convinced that he would find a way to get to her sooner or later. On Thursday, December 26, 1994, 3 days before Christmas, John was put under house arrest. Just a few hours later, as the sun was setting, with a cold winter wind and snowflakes falling from the sky, Delia finished her shift and carefully rode her bicycle onto the road leading to her home. The dark street was empty, illuminated only by the flickering lights of television screens, Christmas garlands, and the dim orange glow of street lamps. Delia leaned her bicycle against the fence near the steps that led to her apartment entrance. It was quiet, peaceful, and safe, or so it seemed. As always, she propped the door with a brick and went back to get her bicycle. Delia was already halfway up the steps, looking around, asking herself if he was hiding in the darkness, when she glanced to the right again and saw his enraged face. Without wasting a second, Delia quickly pushed the brick, allowing the door of her house to slam shut right in front of her. She knew it was better to confront John on the street. If he pushed her into the house, she wouldn't stand a chance to escape. With raised hands, bulging eyes, and clenched teeth, John struck the fragile and defenseless woman with a 2-kilogram axe, while reaching for a knife. He hit her in the chest, piercing her lung, then her thigh, and swung the axe, severing the tip of his finger. Delia could have died, but she didn't. She pulled the bicycle towards her to shield herself from the blows. The sound of the axe scraping against the metal of the bicycle was heard by her neighbor, Giles Allen. Grabbing a baseball bat, he rushed out of his house and chased after John on the street. But John quickly vanished into the darkness, being the coward that he was, afraid to confront a worthy opponent, someone like himself. For the next 6 years, while John remained on the run, friends warned Delia to be cautious, believing that he would come back to finish what he started. But Delia didn't care anymore because she was no longer herself. And even though, after 6 years, 10 parts of a woman's body, carefully packed into 6 different bags, would be discovered at Battlebridge Basin, a London dock in the Regent's Canal, bearing a striking resemblance to Melissa's murder, Delia Bamer would not be the victim. That woman was still alive, because she still had to become John Sweeney's future ex-girlfriend. Having gone on the run, John didn't make much effort to lay low. He headed north, where he visited his mother, as well as his ex-wife Anne and their children. On January 2, 1995, just 11 days after the attack on Delia, John sent a letter to the police and Scotland Yard, boasting about his crimes and claiming they would never catch him. Since the red-haired butcher was easy to find, he decided to hide in another European country. He disappeared from all radars for 6 years. What happened to him during those years, where he was, what he did, and whom he possibly killed, remains unknown. The only certainty is that he returned to his gruesome drawings, promising brutal retribution against women who dared reject him. However, in early 2000, he came back to Britain, where he resumed his search for love. And her name was Paula Fields. As one of 11 children in a poor family living in the poorest district of Liverpool, Paula's childhood, along with her brothers and sisters, was challenging, but their troubles were only beginning. When Paula was 9 years old, her mother passed away, and the children were sent to relatives or placed in shelters. As she grew older, Paula tried her best to become a great mother to her own children. That's why she decided to move to London in search of a better life for her 3 sons, but things only got worse. After 2 years of constant hunger, suffering, and despair, she turned to the oldest profession. In the autumn of 2000, as a homeless woman of loose morals, with no chance of regaining custody of her children, who had been taken by Child Protective Services, Paula's life seemed to hit rock bottom. It was during this time that she met and fell in love with a bearded, red-haired butcher known as Liverpool Joe. Paula, battered and beaten, moved in with him. But what began as an endless cycle of emotional blackmail, psychological pressure, and physical violence soon led to her demise. At 9:30 a.m. on Friday, December 15, 2000, Paula was last seen entering John's apartment. Just 2 days later, the true nature of her beloved was revealed, and 2 days before he moved out of the rented flat, Paula was never seen alive again. On Monday, February 19, 2001, during the school holidays, 2 school children were fishing at the Battlebridge Basin when they noticed a partially submerged black bag. Being boys, they retrieved the heavy bag, hoping to find treasures or at least stolen valuable items. They were shocked for the rest of their lives when they opened the bag and found bricks and body parts. The police recovered 5 more similar bags from the water, but they did not find any hands, feet, heads, or any items or documents. Like Melissa, Paula could have become another Jane Doe, as John had once again gotten away with murder. Or he would have, if he hadn't made a huge mistake. He left one victim alive. Since the police became aware that the wanted assailant for the attack on Delia Bamer had been seen in London, all constables received his description. On Friday, March 23, 2001, the red-haired butcher Joe Johnson was spotted at a construction site. Knowing that he might be armed, the police had their most prepared officers. He indeed had a knife and a gun in his locker. In his apartment, they found more weapons, ammunition, machetes, a homemade bamboo garrote, a baseball bat, a wig with brunette hair, a change of clothes, an axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, a bag with saws and hammers, and over 200 drawings and poems depicting torture, dismemberment, and the death of women. For the attempted murder of Delia, John was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And although he boasted about many murders of his former girlfriends, as well as presumably 2 Germans whom he allegedly caught in bed with Melissa, without evidence, the law was powerless, and investigators feared that John would be released early from prison in a few years and simply disappear. But then another victim of John provided an important clue that helped remove the dangerous criminal from the streets forever. And she did it from beyond the grave. On June 12, 2007, thanks to the advancement of genetic technology, the Dutch police obtained the DNA of the woman whose torso was pulled out of the Rotterdam Canal 18 years ago. By joining forces, Scotland Yard and the Dutch police not only identified Melissa and Paula but also linked their murders, the method of disposing of the bodies, and the identity of the killer, John Sweeney. In court, the most reliable and crucial evidence against the defendant became his own paintings and poems. Detectives were able to establish a chilling connection between the drawings and the murders he was suspected of. In particular, on one drawing, investigators noticed an element hidden under correction fluid. Under ultraviolet light, forensic experts were able to see what was drawn there. It turned out to be a tombstone with the inscription, "Rest in peace, Melissa." But why would he hide this fragment of the painting if he considered all his works simply art? Because it was evidence, he knew about Melissa's death long before her remains were identified. Another painting titled "Beautiful Night in Vienna" depicted an army bag with something inside. It was in such a bag that Melissa was found. However, clues were provided not only by John's paintings. 2 poems represented something like a biographical description of his relationship with Melissa, and 2 hinted or even explicitly spoke of the girl's death. For example, one poem ended with the line, "When I die, perhaps we will become one whole," meaning that she had died, and he knew it for sure. Although the press dubbed John Sweeney as the Canal Killer, he considered himself a scalp hunter, as he signed one of his works, an image of a man with a bloodied axe and a scalp with light hair. The hair most likely belonged to Delia, whom he dedicated the piece to, so to speak, wishing her to depart from life in the most painful way possible. The paintings depicting the murder of Paula were no less disturbing, and he continued to paint her even in prison. Although he was never tried for other murders, the police believe that John's drawings may contain clues to the identities of other victims, particularly 2 women whom the police have never been able to find. They did not find the other body parts of Melissa and Paula. Delia believes that John could have hidden them within the walls of the buildings he worked on as a carpenter. At least, that's what he did with his pet tarantula. On Monday, April 4, 2011, 54-year-old John was found guilty of the murders of Melissa and Paula. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Such a punishment is extremely rare in Britain, but the judge emphasized that Sweeney is too dangerous to ever be released again.